The moment I stepped out of my car, the crisp autumn air hit me like a wave. The leaves crunched underfoot as I walked toward the small house nestled at the end of a quiet suburban street. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. It had been 5 long years since I last saw Max. 5 years since the military told me he was retiring and moving on to a new life. A peaceful one, they said. A life without me. I wasn't prepared for what came next. As I approached the gate, I spotted him almost immediately. There he was, lying lazily in the grass, chewing on a stick like any ordinary dog. But this wasn't just any dog. This was Max, the same loyal companion who had saved my life more times than I could count. His once muscular frame seemed softer now, his glossy coat dulled by time, but there was no mistaking those big brown eyes. Eyes that used to light up whenever I called his name. "Hey, Max," I said softly, crouching down near the fence. My voice cracked slightly, betraying how nervous I felt. "It's me, Jake." He glanced up briefly, his ears twitching at the sound of my voice. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Recognition, maybe. Hope surged inside me. But then, just as quickly, his gaze drifted away, disinterested. He went back to gnawing on his stick, completely oblivious to the man standing before him. My stomach sank. No wagging tail, no excited bark. Nothing. It was like looking into the face of a stranger. I tried again, reaching out my hand through the gaps in the fence. "Come on, buddy. Don't you remember?" My words hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Max didn't even bother to look at me this time. Instead, he stretched out on the grass, letting out a contented sigh as if to say, "Asterisk, you're not important, asterisk." That's when Sarah appeared. She was a kind-looking woman with curly hair and a warm smile, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. "Hi there," she greeted me, walking over with a cup of coffee in her hand. "Are you here to see Max?" I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, I'm an old friend." Her expression softened. "Oh, you must be Jake. We got some papers about you when we adopted him. You were his handler, right?" "That's right," I replied, though the word handler suddenly felt cold and distant. To me, Max wasn't just another assignment. He was family. Sarah knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "He's such a good boy now. Loves playing fetch and taking naps in the sun. He's adjusted really well." Adjusted. That word stung. Had he adjusted so much that he'd forgotten everything we'd been through together? When she noticed the sadness in my eyes, she added gently, "Sometimes, older dogs have trouble remembering things. It's not personal." Not personal, yet it felt deeply personal to me. I stayed a little longer, hoping against hope that Max would show some sign of recognition. But he never did. As I drove away, the image of him lounging in the yard haunted me. How could he not remember? We'd faced danger side by side, shared meals from the same rations, slept under the same stars. Those memories weren't just mine, they were ours. But now, staring at the empty road ahead, I realized something painful. Max had moved on. And maybe, just maybe, he was happier that way. Or was he? Something about his behavior nagged at me. There was no joy in his eyes, no spark of mischief like there used to be, just emptiness. Whatever peace he'd found in retirement, it didn't seem complete. Not yet. That night, sleep eluded me. I couldn't
Every
shake
time
the
I
feeling
closed
that our
my
story
eyes.
wasn't over. Flashes of Max's blank stare haunted me. It wasn't just the fact that he didn't recognize me. It was the way he seemed so detached, like a piece of him was missing. I tossed and turned, replaying every moment we'd spent together in my mind. The missions, the late-night patrols, the silent understanding between us. It all felt like it had been erased. But I couldn't let go. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. If Max couldn't remember me through words or gestures, maybe I could bring something tangible. Something that smelled familiar. Something that carried the weight of our shared past. I rummaged through an old box in my closet until I found what I was looking for. The worn leather leash we used during our deployment. It was scratched, frayed at the edges, and still carried the faint scent of dirt and sweat from years ago. To anyone else, it might have looked like junk. To me, it was priceless. I drove back to Sarah's house, clutching the leash tightly in my hand. My palms were sweaty, and my heart raced as I knocked on the door. When she answered, I explained why I'd come. I brought this, I said, holding up the leash. It was ours. I thought maybe it would help. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's worth a try. Let's see how he reacts. She led me to the backyard where Max was lounging under a tree, basking in the sunlight. His tail thumped lazily against the ground as he watched birds flit around the yard. For a moment, I hesitated. What if this didn't work? What if he still didn't remember? Pushing those doubts aside, I knelt down a few feet away from him and held out the leash. Max, I called softly, my voice trembling. Do you remember this? At first, nothing happened. He glanced at me briefly, then went back to watching the birds. But then, slowly, his nose twitched. He sniffed the air, his head tilting slightly as if trying to place the scent. His ears perked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Yes, buddy, I encouraged, leaning forward eagerly. It's ours. Remember. Instead of bounding toward me like I expected, Max froze. His body stiffened, and his tail stopped wagging. A low whine escaped his throat, followed by a sharp bark that startled both of us. Before I could react, he sprang to his feet, backing away from me with wide, fearful eyes. My stomach dropped. Fear. Why was he afraid? Max, it's okay, I said quickly, keeping my voice calm. It's me, Jake. But he wasn't listening. His barking grew louder, more frantic, echoing across the yard. He spun in tight circles, his movements jerky and panicked. Then, without warning, he bolted toward the house, disappearing inside before I could even call his name again. Sarah rushed after him, calling out soothingly. It's all right, Max. Come here, boy. She glanced back at me, her face pale with concern. I'm so sorry. He's never acted like this before. Are you sure he knows you? I wanted to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Did he know me? Or had I triggered something deep within him? Something painful, something buried. When Sarah returned a few minutes later, she looked shaken. He's hiding under the bed now. I've never seen him like this. Do you think, maybe it's better if you don't come back for a while? Her suggestion hit me like a punch to the gut. Leave? After everything we'd been through. But looking at her worried face, I realized she was right. Whatever connection Max and I once had, it was tangled up in emotions too complicated for either of us to untangle right now. As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. Why had he reacted that way? Was it fear? Confusion? Or was it something deeper, something tied to the memories we'd shared? Whatever it was, one thing was clear. Max wasn't the same dog I remembered. And neither was I the same man he'd known. But somewhere beneath all the layers of time and trauma, I believed there was still a bond waiting to be rediscovered, even if finding it meant facing the hardest truths about ourselves. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and unanswered questions. Max's strange reaction wouldn't leave my mind. Why had he acted so fearful? Was it really possible that seeing me, or the leash, had brought back memories he wasn't ready to face? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his behavior than met the eye. Something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Determined to understand, I started doing some research. I scoured forums, read articles, and even reached out to experts who specialized in retired military working dogs. Most of what I found pointed to one thing: trauma. Dogs like Max weren't just trained for combat. They lived it. Every mission, every explosion, every moment of danger left its mark. Even after retiring, those experiences didn't simply vanish. They lingered, buried deep in their minds, waiting for the right trigger to resurface. But why would I be a trigger? That question gnawed at me. I wasn't the source of his pain. I was supposed to be his anchor, his safe haven. Yet Dr. Emily Carter, a veterinarian I eventually spoke to, offered an explanation that made my chest tighten. Sometimes, she said gently, the people closest to these dogs become unintentional reminders of their past. You represent both safety and danger to Max. Your presence might have stirred up memories he's been trying to forget. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. All this time, I thought visiting Max would bring him comfort. Instead, I might have been reopening old wounds without realizing it. The realization was devastating. Still, I refused to give up on him. If anything, her insight only fueled my determination. There had to be a way to reconnect with Max, to show him that I wasn't a threat anymore, that I was still the same Jake he trusted with his life. Dr. Carter suggested starting small. Try not to overwhelm him, she advised. Bring something familiar, but keep your distance. Let him approach you on his own terms, and above all, be patient. Healing takes time. Armed with her advice, I decided to visit Max again. But this time, I'd do things differently. I packed a few items from our past. The worn leather leash, an old tennis ball we used to play fetch with, and a faded t-shirt I'd worn during our deployment. It smelled faintly of sweat and dust, remnants of the places we'd been together. I hoped these objects would serve as bridges, helping Max piece together the fragments of our shared history. When I arrived at Sarah's house, I could tell she was hesitant. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Last time, well, it didn't go so well." "I know," I replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "But I need to try, for him." She nodded reluctantly and led me to the backyard. Max was lying in the shade, chewing on a bone. When he saw me, his body tensed slightly, but he didn't bark or run away. Encouraged by his calm demeanor, I sat down a few feet away and placed the items on the ground between us. "Hey, buddy," I murmured softly, keeping my tone light and steady. "I brought some things for you." For a long while, nothing happened. Max watched me warily, his eyes flickering between me and the objects. Then, slowly, he stood up and padded closer. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, drawn to the scent of the t-shirt. He circled around it cautiously before finally picking it up in his mouth. My breath caught in my throat. This was progress. Small, fragile, but undeniable. Encouraged, I tossed the tennis ball a short distance away. "Go get it, Max," I urged, my voice tinged with hope. He hesitated for a moment, then trotted over to retrieve the ball. But instead of bringing it back to me, he dropped it halfway and returned to the safety of the porch. His actions were guarded, uncertain. It was clear he wasn't ready to fully trust me yet. Sarah appeared beside me, watching silently. "He's curious," she observed. "That's a good sign." "It is," I agreed, though my heart ached with the weight of how far we still had to go. Max remembered bits and pieces of our bond, but fear still held him back. Rebuilding that connection wouldn't be easy. It would take patience, consistency, and maybe even a bit of forgiveness. As I packed up the items and prepared to leave, I glanced back at Max one last time. He was lying in the grass again, watching me with cautious eyes. For the first time since our reunion, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of hope. Our story wasn't over. Not yet. And I was willing to fight for every step forward, no matter how long it took. The days turned into weeks, and I made it a routine to visit Max every few days. Each time, I brought something familiar, a toy, a scent, or even just my unwavering patience. Progress was slow, almost painfully so, but there were tiny signs that kept me going. The way his tail would flick slightly when he saw the tennis ball. The cautious sniff he gave my old t-shirt before taking a step closer. Even the fact that he no longer bolted away in fear felt like a victory. But there were setbacks too. Some days, Max would ignore me completely, lying in the shade as if I didn't exist. Other times, he'd bark sharply and retreat to the far corner of the yard, his body language tense and guarded. Those moments were hard to swallow. They reminded me how fragile trust could be, especially for a dog who had seen too much and carried scars I couldn't see. One afternoon, as I sat cross-legged on the grass, with the worn leather leash draped over my lap, Sarah joined me. She'd been kind throughout this whole process, offering support without judgment, but today she seemed unusually thoughtful. "You really care about him, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, staring at Max as he chewed on a stick near the fence. "More than you know. He's not just a dog to me. He's family. We went through hell together, and I owe him everything." Sarah sighed, her gaze following mine. "It's obvious how much you love him. But have you ever thought about why he might be struggling? I mean, beyond the trauma." Her question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully, "maybe it's not just about remembering you. Maybe it's about letting go of who he used to be. He wasn't just your partner, Jake. He was a soldier. And now he's trying to figure out how to live as, well, just a dog." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right. For all my efforts to reconnect with Max, I hadn't stopped to consider what he needed. Was I asking him to relive a part of his life he was trying to leave behind? Was I forcing him to be something he no longer wanted to be? That realization changed everything. The next time I visited, I left the leash and t-shirt at home. Instead, I brought a squeaky toy shaped like a duck, a bright, cheerful thing that had nothing to do with our past. When I arrived, Max glanced up from his spot under the tree, his eyes wary but curious. "Hey, buddy," I said, holding out the duck. "Wanna play?" He hesitated, his ears twitching at the sound of the squeak. Slowly, he stood up and padded closer, sniffing the air. For a moment, I thought he might turn away again. But then, to my surprise, he nudged the toy with his nose before grabbing it gently in his mouth. My heart soared. "That's it. Max. Good boy." Encouraged by his interest, I tossed the duck a short distance. This time, instead of ignoring it or dropping it halfway, Max chased after it with genuine enthusiasm. He bounded back to me, wagging his tail, and dropped the toy at my feet. It was the first real interaction we had since our reunion. A playful, light-hearted moment that felt worlds apart from the tension of our earlier visits. Sarah watched from the porch, smiling. "See, he's still got it in him. He just needed permission to let go." Her words stayed with me long after I left that day. Letting go, that was the key. I realize now that Max didn't need me to remind him of who he used to be. He needed me to accept who he was becoming. A happy, carefree dog who could run, play, and enjoy the simple pleasures of life without the weight of his past holding him down. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, because the bond we once shared might never fully return, but also hope, because I could see glimpses of a new connection forming, one built on trust, patience, and mutual respect. Max wasn't the same dog I remembered, and maybe that was okay. Because deep down, he was still Max, and that was enough. The weeks rolled on, and with each visit, Max and I grew closer in small but meaningful ways. The squeaky duck became our bridge, a symbol of the new bond we were building together. He didn't always greet me with excitement, but there were moments when his tail wagged a little faster or his eyes softened as he looked at me. Those tiny victories kept me going, even when progress felt painfully slow. One sunny afternoon, I arrived at Sarah's house with a bag of treats and the duck tucked under my arm. As usual, Max was lounging in the yard, soaking up the warmth of the sun. When he saw me, he lifted his head lazily and gave me a long, appraising look. It wasn't the enthusiastic welcome I'd dreamed of, but it was something real. "Hey, buddy," I said, sitting down on the grass. "Ready to play?" He hesitated for a moment, then trotted over cautiously. I held out the duck, letting him take it in his mouth. Instead of running off, he stayed close, dropping the toy at my feet and nudging it toward me with his nose. My chest tightened with emotion. This was trust, fragile, tentative, but unmistakable. I tossed the duck gently, and he chased after it with more energy than I'd seen in a while. Watching him race across the yard, ears flopping and legs kicking up tufts of grass, I felt a lump rise in my throat. This was Max as he was meant to be. Free, joyful, unburdened by the weight of his past. Not the soldier he once was, but the dog he was learning to become. After a few rounds of fetch, I reached into the bag and pulled out one of the treats. Holding it out to him, I braced myself for rejection. But instead of backing away, Max sniffed it curiously before taking it delicately from my hand. His warm breath brushed against my fingers, sending a jolt of familiarity through me. For a brief second, it felt like old times, the kind of connection we used to share without thinking twice. Sarah, who had been watching quietly from the porch, called out, "Looks like you're making headway." I smiled, though my heart still ached with the knowledge that this relationship would never be exactly what it once was. "Yeah," I replied. "We're getting there." Later that evening, as I sat alone in my living room, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed, not just for Max, but for me too. When I first started visiting him, I'd been so focused on reclaiming what we'd lost that I hadn't considered the possibility of starting fresh. I wanted the Max I remembered, the fearless warrior who stood by my side no matter what. But maybe that version of him didn't exist anymore. And maybe that was okay. What mattered now was moving forward together, letting go of expectations and embracing whatever came next, however imperfect it might be. A few days later, I decided to try something different. Instead of bringing toys or treats, I brought a blanket and sat quietly in the yard, simply being present. Max wandered over eventually, sniffing around me before lying down a few feet away. At first, he kept his distance, but as the minutes ticked by, he inched closer until his body was almost touching mine. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried so much meaning. In that moment, I realized something profound. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It's pieced together bit by bit, stitch by stitch, until the wounds begin to fade. And sometimes, the strongest bonds aren't forged in action or adventure. They're built in quiet moments like this, where two souls sit side by side, sharing space and silence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I rested my hand lightly on Max's back. He didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he let out a soft sigh and leaned into my touch, just barely. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that we were going to be all right. Not perfect, not the same as before, but all right. And that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Max and I settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost effortless. It wasn't the same connection we'd once shared. There were still moments when his eyes clouded with uncertainty, or when he hesitated before approaching me. But it was something new, something tender, something real. One crisp morning, as autumn gave way to winter, I arrived at Sarah's house carrying a thermos of coffee and a cheerful red ball I'd picked up from the pet store. The air was cool, and frost clung to the grass like glittering jewels. Max greeted me with a wag of his tail, a small but unmistakable sign of recognition, and trotted over to investigate the ball in my hand. "Ready to play?" I asked, tossing it gently across the yard. He darted after it with surprising speed, his legs kicking up puffs of frost as he ran. When he returned, dropping the ball at my feet, I noticed something remarkable. There was no hesitation this time, no lingering fear or confusion, just pure, unguarded joy. Watching him bound back and forth, I realized how much lighter he seemed now, how much freer. Sarah joined me on the porch, wrapping her hands around a mug of hot cocoa. "You've done wonders for him," she said, her voice warm with admiration. "He's happier than I've ever seen him." Her words filled me with pride, but they also reminded me of how far we'd come. There had been days when I doubted myself, when Max's distant gaze made me feel like I was failing him. But now, seeing him play with such abandon, I knew we were both exactly where we needed to be. After our game of fetch, I sat down on the grass, letting Max sniff curiously at the pocket of my jacket. Reaching inside, I pulled out a treat and offered it to him. He took it eagerly, his tail thumping against the ground as he chewed. Then, to my surprise, he lay down beside me, resting his head on my knee. His weight was solid and comforting, a reminder of everything we'd been through together, and everything we were building anew. I scratched behind his ears, smiling as his eyes drifted shut. For the first time since our reunion, I didn't feel the need to push for more. This moment, quiet, peaceful, full of trust, was enough. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few days later, Sarah called me with news that stopped me cold. "Jake," she began hesitantly, "something happened last night." My heart sank. "What is it? Is Max okay?" "He's fine," she assured me quickly. "But, well, someone broke into the neighborhood last night. They vandalized a few houses, including mine. Max got really upset. He started barking and growling, even tried to chase them off." I frowned, dread pooling in my stomach. "Did they hurt him?" No, nothing like that," she said. "But it brought back some old behaviors. He's been restless ever since, pacing around the house, refusing to settle down. I thought maybe you could come by, see if you can calm him down." Of course I agreed. As soon as I arrived, I saw what she meant. Max was agitated, his body tense, and his movements erratic. He paced back and forth, his ears perked high, as if bracing for danger. When he spotted me, his expression softened slightly, but the anxiety lingered in his eyes. I knelt down, holding out my hand. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. You're safe." For a moment, he stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, slowly, he walked over and pressed himself against me, seeking comfort. I wrapped my arms around him, murmuring softly until his breathing steadied. It struck me then. Max might have left the battlefield behind, but the instincts ingrained in him, the ones that made him such an incredible soldier, were still part of who he was. And while those instincts could sometimes overwhelm him, they also reminded me of the extraordinary bond we'd always shared. That night, as I drove home, I thought about how far Max had come, and how much work there still was to do. Healing wasn't linear. It was messy and unpredictable, filled with setbacks and breakthroughs alike. But one thing was certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, I would be there for him, just as he had been there for me, all those years ago. Max wasn't just my dog anymore. He was my teacher, my mirror, my reminder that even broken pieces can find a way to fit together again. And in his quiet, steadfast way, he was showing me what it truly meant to heal, not just for him, but for both of us. Months passed, and the bond between Max and me continued to grow stronger. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when his old fears resurfaced, or when he seemed distant. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that we were learning to navigate this new chapter together, step by step. One chilly spring morning, I arrived at Sarah's house with a surprise tucked under my arm, a framed photo of Max and me from our deployment days. In the picture, we stood side by side, dusty but grinning, the desert stretching endlessly behind us. I had hesitated for weeks about whether to bring it, worried it might stir up painful memories. But something told me it was time. When Max saw me, he trotted over, his tail wagging lazily. I knelt down and showed him the photo, holding it close enough for him to sniff. At first, he just stared at it, his head tilted slightly as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, to my astonishment, he let out a soft bark and nudged the frame with his nose. "Do you remember, buddy?" I asked softly, my voice thick with emotion. "That's us." He didn't respond right away, but after a moment, He sat down beside me, leaning into my leg. It wasn't the enthusiastic reaction I'd imagined, but it was enough. Enough to tell me that somewhere deep inside, he still carried pieces of our past, and that those pieces were no longer sources of fear, but reminders of strength. Sarah watched from the porch, her eyes glistening. "You two are incredible," she said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it." Her words stayed with me long after I left that day. They made me think about how much Max and I had healed, not just individually, but together. He had taught me patience, resilience, and the importance of meeting someone where they are, without judgment or expectation. And I hoped that, in return, I had given him the space to rediscover himself, freed from the shadows of his former life. As spring turned into summer, Max began to change in subtle ways. His once guarded demeanor softened further, replaced by a calm confidence that reminded me of the dog he used to be. He played more freely, explored the yard with curiosity, and even started greeting me with excited barks when I arrived. Each small victory felt monumental, proof that healing was possible, even after everything we'd been through. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the yard, I sat on the grass with Max lying contentedly beside me. I scratched behind his ears, listening to the rhythmic thump of his tail against the ground. For the first time in years, I felt at peace, not because things were back to how they used to be, but because they were exactly as they needed to be. "You're happy now, aren't you, buddy?" I murmured, resting my hand on his back. He let out a low, satisfied sigh, his body relaxing completely. It was such a simple moment, yet it carried so much weight. All the pain, frustration, and longing had led us here, to a place where we could simply be together, without needing anything more. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about how far we'd come. Max wasn't the same dog I remembered, and I wasn't the same man. But that was okay. Life isn't about clinging to the past. It's about finding beauty in the present and hope in the future. Together, Max and I had done just that. And though our journey wasn't over, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what lay ahead, we would face it side by side, just as we always had.